Hello and welcome to this video on the search for healing and emotional freedom therapy. In this video, I'm going to try to answer a very good question that one of my fellow therapists, one of my colleagues asked me, which is, when we work on trauma and negative emotion to release them, to treat the traumas, why are we doing it exactly, and how does it relate to the strategy that we have to treat a trouble? And what's the relationship between the troubles that we try to treat and the traumas that we work on? So this video is going to answer this question, hopefully. And the question really is, are traumas the cause or the consequence of our troubles? So before we move on, a short disclaimer. So I'm not a doctor. All of the information provided here are for educational purpose only. So please be aware of that and be mindful that you are responsible for your own use of these information. That being said, let's move on. And let's start to answer this question in the field of psychotherapy or emotional well-being. So generally, when we have somebody come to us, a therapist, with an issue, we work around what's the issue and what are the emotions that the persons feel around this issue. And we try to analyze all of the emotional things that are happening. So for example, let's say, and I'm going to take an example from a real client. Let's say somebody has a hard time making friends. That person experiences social anxiety. Okay, so we put that person in the situation where it's hard to make friends, it's hard to engage conversation with people, and we analyze, what do you feel in your body? What are the emotions that come up? And we found this list of emotions. So there is fear of engaging the conversation, fear of rejection, feeling unworthy, sadness, and aloneness, of course. So in that situation, that person tells herself these things that correspond to the emotions. I'm afraid of talking to people. People will find me silly, so it's not even worth trying to engage a conversation in the first place. And it's my fault. I am lame. I undervalue myself. I feel bad about myself. And I'm sad, I will never make it, and I'm alone, nobody likes me, it will always be this way. This kind of self-talk, negative self-talk. So every emotion has a corresponding sentence, right? And so we ask ourselves, are these emotions the cause or the consequence of the issue? Well, if we take the coaching approach, in coaching we would have the idea that if we take action and if we dare to overcome our fear, then we can make progress and we can learn how to become more efficient and more skilled, and we can actually move towards success. So the coaching mindset would be something like, if I trust myself and dare take action, even if it's scary or uncomfortable, then by taking action, I will have a result. So I won't be sad anymore. And then I will gain self-confidence. I will have more trust in myself, more strength, and then I will overcome my fear, right? Right. While in therapy, we would think the other way around. We would start from, I am afraid, and that's why I don't take action. I don't dare to take that action because I have that fear. And because I don't take action and because I'm afraid, then I undervalue myself, I feel lame, I feel bad about myself, and then of course the result of all that is I feel sad and alone. So as you can see in both approaches, we would take the problem completely the other way around. So it seems like both ways are actually correct from a certain point of view. It's as if in coaching we think the problem really is that I don't dare to take action. But if I did, then I could overcome the struggles. I could overcome the negative emotions. The negative emotions are merely the consequence of me not taking action. While in therapy, we think, no, it's because of the emotion that you don't take action. So what we have to treat really is the emotion, and then taking action will be more natural and more easy. So both approaches are correct, and why it's so. If we want to understand what's going on and really answer that question, we need to understand how trauma works. And by trauma, I mean emotion. I will put in the trauma category every negative emotion for the purpose of this talk today. So I'm going to simplify things a little bit, but what happens is when we have a trauma, so when we experience a shock or a negative emotion, that negative emotion and the negative belief that comes along gets imprinted in our body and our psyche. And the next time that we are confronted with a situation which is similar, the same emotional reaction will happen. So we will have a behavior that corresponds to the trauma. And therefore, we will not have the results that are optimal in the situation. We will actually play out the trauma. And therefore, the trauma reinforces itself each time you have a situation like that. Because each time you have the same behavior, the same consequences, so you feel bad about those consequences, and the next time it happens, it comes up automatically. It's not something that we choose, it's something that is triggered and it's conditioned, so it's automatic. So it's actually a cycle, you see? It's like the chicken or the egg. Which one starts first? Because it's such a cycle. Well, maybe there's an origin to that, but let's go deeper. So traumas are stacked over time. It's a concept we call the trauma stack, and it comes from different trauma healing therapies. In EMDR, for example, they have that concept, but we also have that concept in appeased therapy. So trauma stacks means that every time you experience a trauma, a negative emotion in a situation, it reinforces the negative conditioning and emotion from a previous situation, which itself generally comes from another previous situation, and so on and so on. And that's why we call it a stack, because in all these situations, it's the same emotion. So every time you get traumatized, or every time you experience a negative emotion, it's reminding you of a previous situation where the same emotion was present. And every time a new situation arises and the trauma repeats itself, the stack compounds. So traumas are stacked over time. And that's why we can often track back the origin of those traumas in previous experiences, for example, childhood experiences. Why? Because in childhood we are more vulnerable, we are more relying on other people for safety, like our parents, and also we are in the learning, the absorbing phase of our life where we absorb everything, so we are more susceptible to trauma. So when we experience something negative at age 41, for example, it might come from something we experienced at age 3, for example, right? So we also find this principle of the trauma stack in the biology. So in appeased therapy, we don't just rely on the techniques that we have an underlying model, a theoretical explanation of how things work, and this model is based on biology, and especially on subcellular psychobiology, which is something I explain in details in other videos. But what we found is that in the biology, inside the cells, we find that traumas are stored in structures that also repeat this stacking concept, which you can see here on this diagram. So traumas are actually stored in what we call epigenetic damages. So epigenetics means what's around the gene. So on this diagram, you can see at the bottom, you have the DNA, so that's the genes, and around it you have the histones. Histones are proteins that are going to open or close, and they open when we need to express a gene, and then they close to protect the gene. But when there is epigenetic damage, the structures are not going to open, they stay stuck, they stay locked, and the gene cannot be expressed. What happens instead is we have this structure with a string of something we call messenger RNA. So that's basically supposed to be a copy of the gene, of the DNA, and it's supposed to be used by our metabolism by those big structures that you can see, which are called ribosomes. So when there is no trauma and we have the metabolic capacity, the histone opens itself, the gene expresses itself, so it copies itself into a messenger RNA. So messenger RNA goes out and it gets used by the ribosome that then reads the codes and creates a protein. And then we use the protein. That's when there is no trauma. But when there is a trauma, when there is epigenetic damage, the histone stays stuck and there is a messenger RNA, but it also stays stuck. So instead of releasing and being used, the ribosomes try to read it, but they get stuck on it. And the whole structure gets stuck and you don't have the protein. You don't have the good result of what your gene is supposed to do. And in those structures, in those ribosomes, you have traumatic memories. So that's where the psychology and the biology comes together. So as you can see here, we have images of different ages in life. And on this diagram, we even include pre-birth memories, because it turns out that, yes, our biology stores pre-birth memories. It stores the memory of its own development. And if we have epigenetic damages, then they play out in our development. And so you can see the trauma stack being present in very concrete, tangible elements of our biology. Now, what I showed you before is something we called, this is biographical traumas. Biographical means that happens within our life. But it's not the only form of epigenetic damages. Because we also have a form of epigenetic damages that we call generational trauma. Generational because they are passed down from our ancestors to us, and we pass it down to our offspring. They are placed in a different place inside the cell, but there's also a structure that looks like a stack. It's actually a stack of generational memories. I'm going to come back to it. But to come back to what a trauma is, we know that a previous trauma conditions us to relieve the same trauma in the future in similar condition. So when we have trauma, we have more traumas. Therefore, an efficient therapy often needs to find the root cause of the issue. We don't treat the symptom, we try to find the origin of the problem. So if we are working on traumas, then we work backward in time to find when did it start, what was the first trauma. That's the idea behind regression. But as you can see, negative emotions related to an issue are both the cause and the consequence. There's something before, but because of that, we experience more trauma, which is then the cause of more trauma, and it's a cycle. So negative emotions are both the cause and the consequence of troubles most of the time. And one approach that works very well is to use regression. There are many regression techniques, but the goal of regression techniques is to reach the bottom of the trauma stack. So it's actually working on the biology to get closer to the epigenetic damage. So there are many techniques, of which EFT, EMDR, hypnosis, breathwork are very well known. In pixel therapy, we have our own technique called wholehearted healing. Or another approach is to use a technique that eliminates the whole stack directly. And that's what we do in peak states. We don't use regression most of the time. We use another technique that directly eliminates the whole stack from the present. So if you experience a negative emotion in the present, and we work on it with pixel therapy, it's going to eliminate the original trauma without regression. That's very useful, very practical, and fast, and also easier to do for the person. Now, as you understood from biographical and generational trauma before, what we found in pixel therapy and in subcellular psychobiology is that generational traumas are the most predominant original cause of our trouble. So they're more important than biographical traumas in general, and by a large proportion. And that's why I prefer to most of the time work on generational traumas, because it's faster, easier, deeper actually, and it's as efficient as biographical traumas. And I work with people who sometimes had very severe traumas like PTSD, aggression, abuse, etc., etc. So really hard biographical events, but generally we still work on the generational level because it makes things much easier, and it also solves the biographical memories. So for most psychological issues, to use an efficient emotional freedom therapy technique such as EFT, EMDR, breathwork, psychosomatic techniques, and so on, is often sufficient to treat the issue if that technique addresses the root cause. And that's a big stake, is as a practitioner taught to be to do regression correctly? Is the technique addressing regression in the correct way? And so on and so on. It's complicated. It's what makes it complicated. We need to find the root cause. But if we do, generally it's very efficient. So in appeased therapy, we find that for about 70% of cases in general psychotherapy, there is a direct relationship between the issue and the emotion. For example, my issue is an emotion. So for example, I have fear, or I have shame, or I have anger, or I have relationship issues, and it's actually an emotional issue, and so on and so on. The issue is related to emotions. Sometimes several emotions, sometimes just one, but it's direct. And in that case, doing this kind of techniques is really, really efficient, very simply by addressing the root cause of the trauma. And to back up my claim, EFT is one of the most well-studied techniques in this field. There are many, many clinical studies and scientific investigation. It has demonstrated an 86% success rate on post-traumatic stress disorder. So things like war traumas or aggression traumas, and so on and so on. So PTSD is often thought to be very hard to treat in traditional psychology, because most of what traditional psychologists do is just talk about it. So it's not really using an emotional release technique. But when we use a correct emotional release technique, such as EFT, in a few sessions, it's gone. That's because we're addressing really the root cause of the problem, which is the emotion and the trauma, and we use the correct technique, so it works. Now, that's for 70% of cases in general psychotherapy, but there also are many indirect relationships between the presenting issue and the root cause trauma. So let me give you an example. So to make things really clear, let's say that we have an issue and the issue got triggered at some stage, some moment in life. There's a difference between the trigger and the programming. So the trigger, if I use the analogy of a pistol, is what you push so that you can fire the pistol, right? But that's not where the bullets come from. The bullet is stored in the storage part, so it's the programming. Actually, I shouldn't have the arrow going to this area, it should be to the barrel, right? My mistake. But anyway, you get the point. So when we have a trouble, it's because the trigger was pulled and therefore we have the bullet, that's the trouble. But if we release the trigger, it's not gonna make the bullet come back, right? Once the bullet is out, it's out. And if we want to treat the real root cause of the trouble, treating the trigger is not going to do a lot. It's going to relieve things a little bit, but not really a lot. Because what we need to address is the programming. It's the original root cause. It's what really makes it that there is a bullet to start from. Okay? So in that case, treating the triggering events is generally not efficient in treating the trouble, and you need a scientific investigation method to determine what is the root cause trauma. And psychology is often insufficient. Why? Because there is no direct link between the issue and the emotion, meaning the original trauma. So from the analysis of the problem, you cannot find the origin. It's hidden, it's indirect. and therefore you can talk about it, think about it a lot, and investigate it a lot, and never really find the solution. That happens in a minority of cases, but still maybe around 30%. So what we do in our institute is we do research, and we focus on subcellular psychobiology. So psychobiology is the combination of psychology and biology, but not general biology. We look at what's happening inside the cells, in subcellular structures. And if you want to learn more about it, you can listen to my video, which is an introduction to subcellular psychobiology, to understand it. So let me take an example to make things more even clearer. So chronic fatigue syndrome. So we can empirically observe that chronic fatigue syndrome is often triggered by panic attacks. It's not always the case, it's just an observation. I've had many people come to me with CFS and ask me, can we treat it? It started with this event, and this event was a panic attack. So it's often the case, but not necessarily always. Now, in that case, treating the panic attack as a trauma, because it is a trauma, does not solve CFS. We can go back to the moment where the CFS started, heal that, but the CFS remains. So why is that so? Because we need to find the programming trauma, and the programming is not the trigger. I hope that makes sense. All right, so on the internet, there are many testimonials and clinical cases of the efficiency of EFT, for example, but also other techniques in the help of spontaneous remission of a range of diseases. If you go on the internet, you will find, oh, I had multiple sclerosis and it's gone. I had some neurological disorders like spondylarthritis, I don't know the English word for it, autoimmune disorders, cancer, all kinds of things. And that's great that those people were able to feel better and overcome those challenges, and that's great. But what is the part that EFT played exactly? And does it work for many people or just some people? We don't really know. So in theory, when you do EFT or other techniques such as appeased therapy, you have an impact on the biology. You have an impact on repairing epigenetic damages, which is fundamental to an increased health. But be careful about it. Beware of this announcement because you don't really know what's happening and these claims are not always backed up. So have that in mind, but by all means, try it because EFT is safe. Appeased therapy is pretty safe. We advise people on the risk when there are some risks, but you can always try to work on the emotions and the traumas because they have an impact on our health. However, be careful about what it means in terms of healing things, healing diseases. It's most of the time a bit too bold, right? So as a conclusion, it is useful to free yourself from all possible traumas for many reasons. The first one is because it's going to relieve your current suffering. You're going to feel better, you're going to feel more at peace, stronger, calmer, more positive, more loving, etc., etc. You will feel better. It's also useful to prevent future suffering because you understand if you healed your traumas from the past, then you will not relive those traumas in the future. They are gone from the future. You are protected. You can also free yourself from unconscious avoidances and compensations. That's because we are not consciously aware of all of our negative emotions. Most of the time we try to run away from them. We try to hide them to compensate. So if we have some fears, we're going to act out in ways where we try to compensate for those fears, or we try to run away from those fears and avoid things that maybe we should be doing, etc., etc. And also another reason which is important for some people is when we heal our traumas, then we are not going to transmit them to our children. So if you want to protect your children, one thing you can do is work on yourself and clear out your own emotional baggage. And maybe in the future, we will be able to use these techniques to treat deeper disorders. It's already happening and it will happen more and more. So a good preparation for that is to learn how to do it, to learn the techniques, to practice the fact of healing yourself from as many traumas as you can, so that when those disorders treatments will become available, you will be ready to use them. It will be easy. That's my suggestion. So as a conclusion, trauma processing is, in my opinion, and from what I know, the most powerful lever for human happiness and personal fulfillment, evolution, well-being in general, also mental health and physical health. So heal your traumas. I hope this inspired you. I hope this gave you a lot of insights and a lot of answers. So let me know if you have any comment or any question, and I'll see you in another video. Thank you for watching and talk to you soon.